Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I stared out of the window of the kitchen of our red brick Georgian farmhouse that had been in my second husband's family line for many generations. I think I must have been drying some dishes at the time, I can't be sure. For a moment I stood very still, watching the rain pelting down. It was coming down in cats and dogs. It was late afternoon. The rain splattered against the window panes, and it brought me a wonderful sense of comfort. I was in my cosy kitchen, and the world outside my window was being soaked in April showers. The viridescent countryside twinkled brightly as it hungrily soaked up the rain like a thirsty athlete who's been very dehydrated after a long, arduous run. We needed this rain desperately, and the natural world responded to it thankfully, as if all the shrubbery, the grass and trees were groaning with relief. I could feel that appreciation, as if it was tangible. I knew a lot more of this refreshing rain was to come, and that it would transform the countryside, so that the bleached grass, from an insufferable long, very dry winter we had experienced, with cruel cold days that had sometimes gone right through to the bone, would now be a thing of the past. The countryside, after the treacherous winter, looked a little worse for wear, like someone who's been living rough on the streets, needing to wipe away the grimy dirt from their faces, enjoying a good bath and a fresh change of clothes. Likewise, the countryside was dusty, parched, scorched, tired-looking, with plants that had struggled through the winter. But with this blissful rain, I knew in the morning I would see the landscape gratefully transformed, recovering with green blades of grass and perennial seedlings audaciously shooting their way through the earth, and some of the barren trees, whose boughs had been shamelessly naked for so long, would get a brand new change of clothes and regain their modesty again with a plethora of new leaves. Once the rain came down, the light of the afternoon had dipped, as if someone had turned down the dimmer switch at the mains, so everything looked terribly pretty under a subdued but gentle gossamer light. I adored the rain. It made me meditate and take stock of things. It cleared away the cobwebs from my mind, as much as it removed the dust from the plants. In this perfect moment, when I basked in my tranquil revelry, I reflected how my life had changed since I'd left the Big Apple. I'd grown up in New York, in Doyer Street in Manhattan, which is one of the most historically rich streets in Chinatown. I grew up in an apartment there with my parents, and then when I married my husband, I moved to the Upper West Side, where I lived in 86th Street. I considered myself a city girl. I had lived there all my life. My husband had died when I was in my early 60s, and I quite literally prepared myself to sadly spend the rest of my life on my own. I had never envisaged at this late stage of my life that I would ever fall in love again. That sort of thing did not happen to women of my age. Well, so I thought. My husband Thomas sadly died of a stroke. I remember that day so clearly, as if it was yesterday. I am told one always remembers the traumatic things that impact your life. Me and Thomas had been planning to meet my daughter for lunch that day, and I remember he went off to get his tweed jacket to wear. Even when my husband was casual, he always looked remarkably smart and well put together. He always made a special effort to look debonair, even when he was being casual. I think his military background had made him incredibly disciplined in this regard. Everything in his entire wardrobe was so neat, all his shoes lined up in perfect precision, and most of them gleaming so brightly you could almost see your reflection in them. On this morning my husband seemed to lack his usual zestful enthusiasm, and admitted to me he felt slightly off. I remember he came into the kitchen to ask me which shoes he should wear to lunch, the crocodile ones or the smart leather boots. And then quite suddenly he dropped down dead. At first I thought he had passed out and fainted, but then when I touched him, I realized he was gone. I tried desperately to perform CPR on him, but it was like thrashing a dead fish vigorously against a stone wall. It was never, ever going to work, and he never came back to life. It took me a long time to recover from his death. In my life he had been my very best friend, and now the man who had always had my back was gone for good, and that was very difficult to have to live with. I knew living on my own would be a lonely affair, One person in a marital partnership always usually dies before the other, and as me and my husband were the same age, I had clandestinely hoped it would be me that went first, not the other way round. My husband was an extremely fit man, with a disciplined daily exercise regime and a healthy diet. At least when there are two of you, it stands to reason that you can weather the storms of life together. It's so much easier when there are two of you at the helm of a ship rather than just one. You have a much better chance of getting to shore safely. Things can become unhinged a little when you're steering your way through life all on your own. I felt as decimated as a building that very suddenly is bulldozed and collapses to the ground with one big lunge from an indiscriminate wrecking ball, and then everything falls apart and crumbles away. The loneliness of not being able to share my life with the man I loved was unbearable. I would sometimes come home to the apartment, to the saddest looking place you've ever seen, where the absence of my husband was so pronounced. I sometimes expected him to peer at me from behind the kitchen counter like he always would in the past, and say, "Sweetheart, how about I fix you a nice glass of cold Cabernet Sauvignon?" Or I expected him to burst through the door with a parcel of delicious-looking food he'd bought at the Delicatessence, so that we could picnic together in front of one of our favourite movies. I always believe it was my black cat Sooty that changed both of our lives exponentially, and it was also Sooty who pulled me through the dark night of the soul that I experienced after my husband's fortuitous death. Sometimes our animals can be like little earth angels. I remember discovering Sooty in a drain 5 years before Thomas died. A little half-drowned kitten she was that I brought home with me, wrapped up in the warmth of my arms. She was the sorriest-looking sight I'd ever seen. The poor little kitten was wet and cold, very thin, and I knew a night spent outdoors in this grim weather would be the cat's very last if I didn't rescue it. I knew in the morning the cat would likely be dead as a dodo. "Look, Thomas," I said to him, "look what I found." Thomas would never agree for us keeping an animal in our apartment, not even a cat, but Sooty changed everything the day I brought her home. At first Thomas said, "Well, you know we can't keep her. We'll take her to the shelter in the morning." Then it was the next day and the next week that we would be taking her to the shelter. Of course, it never happened, as Sooty settled down happily in our apartment, as if she'd always belonged. I could see Thomas had grown very attached to her, as his face would light up like a Christmas tree when Sooty would curl up on his lap when he read the paper. After Thomas tragically died, Sooty went on with life, with the resilience you always see in an animal. I knew she missed Thomas, but she lived in the moment, and at the same time, my sensitive, loyal companion could sense my grief, and in my lowest moments would come to my side to comfort me. She would sleep in my arms and brush against me lovingly, as if to say, "It's all going to be all right." If it wasn't for Sooty, I think I would have been tempted to swallow a whole bunch of pills. It takes courage and endurance, and a great deal of balls to move on with your life. Don't get me wrong, I had friends who cared a lot about me, a daughter and grandchildren, but at the end of the day they had their own lives to live, and I would never have imposed myself on any of them. One day I told myself that I would pretend to be happy. That would be a start. I would go through my day with a big smile, looking at everything positively, and soon my fake happiness really became real. I began to thoroughly enjoy life again. I soon realized that even though I was all on my own, I could find things to enjoy. So I got involved in art and cookery classes, where I made new friends. It never gets too late to improve on yourself, you know. I know people my age who have gone back to university to get a degree that they would probably never need in their life, but it made sense to always be growing. Even an old bush that's been around for centuries constantly produces new shoots and leaves. If it didn't, it wouldn't serve any meaningful purpose. It was 17 years after Thomas's death that I was taking my daily walk in Central Park, situated on the Upper East Side and West Side of Manhattan. I understand it's the 5th largest park in the city. I've always enjoyed walking as a recreational exercise. It's the one exercise you can do throughout your life that has no negative impact on your joints. I learnt that people who walk are far happier than other athletes, and outlive them all. On this day the weather was sweltering, and not exactly the most pleasant day for walking. The great thing about the beautiful park is that there are always a plethora of trees that offer some spectacular shade. There was an ice cream van at the edge of the park, where people emerged like ants from an anthill to buy themselves ice creams on a cone. Who could blame them? This was ice cream weather. I began to walk under the shade of the trees, but it was still unpleasantly hot, a sticky, humid heat. As I was walking, all of a sudden a friendly grey schnauzer came bounding up to me, with its lead still intact, dragging behind her, but with no owner in sight. The dog was well groomed, very friendly, and wearing an expensive collar covered in diamante, fake diamonds. "Where is your owner?" I asked the dog, taking it by the lead and scanning my immediate environment. I was expecting to see a person frantically looking for their dog, but all I could see was a group of people in the park, attending to a yoga lesson under the trees, and a woman walking her 2 pugs, but beyond that, there wasn't a solitary soul in sight. "Aren't you a lovely little thing?" I said, leaning over the dog to stroke her. I noticed that on her collar she had a little tag with the name Ruby on it and a telephone number. "I'm going to find your owner for you," I assured her. I pulled out my cell phone from my purse and punched in the number. "Hello," came a male voice. "Hello, I'm sorry to phone you. My name is Sandy Phillips. I'm phoning you about a schnauzer called Ruby. I have her here with me. Do you happen to be missing a dog?" "Oh, my goodness," said the voice. "I was reading a Dick Francis book on the park bench. I think Ruby must have run off. She's very energetic at times. Probably didn't appreciate doing nothing. Where do you say you are? Are you in the park?" "I am," I said. "There's a yoga class being conducted not far from where I'm standing under the trees. I'm not sure if that gives you an indication of my bearings." "Good. Stay exactly where you are. I'll find you." And then there he was, walking through the park, carrying a Dick Francis novel in his hand, and wearing a warm smile on his face. I couldn't believe that this late in my life my heart could flip over like a pancake, but it did in that moment. The moment I laid eyes on Wilder Slayman, I remember blushing like a silly schoolgirl when I handed over Ruby's lead to him. "I'm so sorry," said Wilder. "I must have dozed off. I'm not from New York, you know. I came here to the park to escape the rat race, bury myself in a novel. I fell asleep on the park bench over there," he said, pointing to the distance. "Don't tell Dick Francis," he teased. "He would not be impressed if he knew one of his novels sent me right off to sleep. I can't get into this one for some reason. It seems Ruby here had other ideas. She's one of those exasperating little dogs that has way too much energy for her small size. She can be quite restless at times. She thoroughly enjoys exploring." "Well, the strange thing was she came right up to me, as if she'd known me all her life," I said. "Is that so, Ruby? What do you have to say for yourself, you treacherous young lady?" Wilder teased, but Ruby looked up at him innocently, through her dark eyes, as if butter would not melt in her mouth. "I think if the truth be told, Ruby wanted to meet you," said Wilder. "She's not partial to strangers, you know. She's very discerning as a dog. Would you like to go somewhere for a coffee? Or do you have a husband you need to get home to, who would be most upset with you trotting off with a perfect stranger for a cup of coffee?" "I'll say no to the coffee," I said. Wilder's face looked disappointed, but a big smile formed on his face when I said, "No, there is no husband I need to go home to. He died 17 years ago. But I will say yes to a nice coffee. This weather is too hot for a warm beverage." "I thought you were about to turn me down just then," said Wilder. "Ruby and I would have been most affronted, wouldn't we, Ruby?" he said. Once again Ruby appeared completely nonchalant and indifferent to our useless conversation. It would seem in her world, actions spoke far louder than words. She knew a trip to the local coffee shop would mean a large scoop of vanilla ice cream. It would seem that Ruby was not lactose intolerant, and ice cream was her favourite treat. Of course I did tell Wilder ice cream wasn't that good for dogs, But he said Ruby deserved a treat once in a while, especially on a scorching, insufferable day like this, and I had to heartily agree at that. We had coffee together at a coffee shop which had chairs and tables on the street, and the waitress brought little Ruby a bowl of water, which she lapped up gratefully, and then she dived into a large scoop of ice cream with gusto. It was a blistering hot day for New York. You could see the frayed looks on people's faces, all suffering from heat exhaustion. The air around us felt like a sauna. It really was unpleasant. But the iced coffee brought us much refreshment. I was to learn that Wilder was temporarily staying in his granddaughter's brownstone apartment in the Prospect Heights neighborhood in Brooklyn. She had recently had a baby, and explained that the baby was always screaming. It would seem his granddaughter Cherry was exhausted, so he was enjoying giving her a helping hand. "My daughter can't sleep at the moment," he explained. "Her baby tirelessly screams throughout the night. I'm very fortunate. I don't hear a thing," he exclaimed, "because I take my hearing aids out in the evening, and without them I'm quite deaf, which can be useful with a screaming baby around. I came to stay with my granddaughter to help her out, you see. Her husband's in Dubai doing some kind of business deal. It turns out it's quite lucrative working out there. But let's not kid. On a day like this weather is on par with Dubai." I was to learn that Wilder had lost his wife Linda 10 years ago, after she died from breast cancer. "It was a gut-wrenching time for me and, of course, for my family," he told me. "But at least we were able to say goodbye to my wife. She died peacefully in her sleep, and she never suffered from any pain, not with the advanced medications they have these days, you see. So I'm very thankful for that." Wilder lived in a red-brick farmhouse among the gorgeous rolling hills of the West Portland countryside, where you may also find checkered fields of farmers' different crops. It's about an hour away from Cannon Beach. This was where he raised his family, and even after his wife had died, he remained living there on his own. "You're braver than me," I told him. "Living in a huge house on your own in the countryside, I mean. I know for me, after Thomas died, well, it was hard to return back to the apartment. I felt incredibly lonely, but I hasten to say my cat Sooty saved my life. She was attached to Thomas, but if she could bounce back from a tragic event so seamlessly like that, then I knew I could also." Wilder laughed, rubbing his hand over his chin and staring at me through twinkling grey eyes. "You know what, Sandy? You're speaking my language. I know exactly how you felt. And yes, the farmhouse felt very lonely and rather gloomy, I have to say. But if I gave it up, it would be like giving up a huge part of myself. The family have lived in that farmhouse for so many generations, and I likewise intend to leave this place to my granddaughter. She'd love to live there and give up her life here in the Big Apple for a more relaxed lifestyle. My daughter wanted to move out. Needless to say, other members of my family, always thinking they know what is best for me, wanted me to sell up the farmhouse, claiming it was far too big for me. But part of the land I've managed to let out to a farmer for his dairy herd to graze. It's a win-win situation the way I see it. The only time I will leave that farmhouse is when I can't physically walk out of the front door. But sell it? Never. I will never sell the place." Let's just say over the next couple of weeks, Wilder and I became inseparable. One day when he was leaving New York, he invited me to come and stay with him at his red-bricked farmhouse in West Portland. The rest is history. It was like a repetition of what had happened when I'd found Sooty lying there in the gutter. I would tell Wilder, "I'm only going to stay for the weekend, then I've got to get back to New York." He would then encourage me to stay just one more day. "Another one? Why not just one more day?" he'd say. And then one more day would lead to 2, and then 3. I would reluctantly agree to stay a little longer, always just a little longer. "Sooty and I need to get back to New York," I would tell him. Yet in truth, what did we need to get back to a lonely apartment for? What was there waiting for us? And as far as Sooty was concerned, the countryside was so much more preferable than a stuffy New York apartment. It would seem days merged into weeks and then into months. And Wilder said to me one day, "This is crazy. I love you, Sandy, and I hope you love me too. It makes no sense at all, us living apart like this. We are like two parts of an apple that belong together. We shouldn't be apart. Sell your apartment in New York, move in with me, and let's get married." And so we did just that, and never regretted blowing all caution to the wind with the impetuous enthusiasm of a youngster, only a quarter of our age, I have to say. Suffice to say, Sooty had already moved into Wilder's house, taking claim to the place as if she was the owner, and we were all but the lodgers. Cats can have a haughty superiority, and believe that they have taken ownership over everything that you own. They own you, not the other way round, and don't you forget it either. I hasten to say, she got on famously with little Ruby the Schnauzer, as long as little Ruby knew that Sooty was in charge of everything. Ruby didn't seem to mind being towed into line by my very presumptuous cat, so things were looking remarkably good. I think Sooty thought that all her Christmases had come at once, when she realized that she owned an enormous property where there was no end in sight. There were trees to climb, rats to be caught from the barn to bring into the house as ghastly-looking presents. Wilder told me I needed to praise her for her hunting prowess. "It's very good she's keeping the rat population down. You need to encourage her. She believes she's bringing you a great gift." I didn't think Wilder was right. Encouraging Sooty to hunt was not my idea of sagacious advice, but needless to say, I did thank Sooty. I would say thank you, wringing up my nose in disgust and removing the warm furry carcass from the floor. And let's just say that frequent deliveries of unmentionables always made their way into our house. By all accounts, I had no idea that something so serendipitous as meeting Wilder and being swept off my feet could happen to me. And I considered Ruby the Schnauzer the world's greatest matchmaker, because even at our age, sparks were still flying between us. I continued to stare out of the kitchen window at the rain pelting down. It looks like it's here to stay. I marvel at how my life has changed, how happy I am with Wilder, how lucky we were to meet so fortuitously at Central Park. I could so easily have given up on life in my 60s, but here I was in my late 70s, with a whole new lease on life. I never imagined a life spent away from New York in the Portland countryside, that it would be my cup of tea, but I had blossomed out here, thoroughly enjoying the scenery and the crisp fresh air, and believe it or not, for me, it felt like a brand new beginning in the autumn of my life. In truth, I believe you're never too old to begin again. As I stare out at the rain, I see a dark figure moving hurriedly into the trees of the wood grove. It looked like it was covered in long hair. A bear, I thought. It had happened so quickly for me, but it looked like a very strange bear, and bigger than your average black bear. I had imagined it, I told myself. Maybe with age I was seeing things that weren't actually there. Silly me, I thought. It must have just been a trick of the light. I made a mental note after the first April rains, that once the rains receded, I'd be taking a long stroll in that wood grove. Even though Wilder was in his 70s, he still worked for a small part of the day in his offices. "I told myself I would never ever retire," he informed me. "I don't want my brain to atrophy, and I enjoy bringing in an income that I don't even need. It keeps the brain cells young, you know, and I enjoy being industrious. I would literally die of boredom if I had to twiddle my fingers all day." One day after some April showers, when spring had taken her dominant hold over the countryside, having held the winter days back into submission, so that the cold, cool days had been vanquished like an insubordinate child being expelled from school. It was still a little fresh on this day, but the wood grove was ablaze with abundant life, and the tall, lofty maple and oak trees were covered in a plethora of brand new leaves. I decided I wanted to take a leisurely walk in the wood grove, and there rarely was a spring in my step, as if I was a young girl again. I forgot about the slightly disabling arthritis in my fingers and the discomfort in my hip that the doctor had warned me that at some point might require a hip replacement. "That's the problem, Sandy, when you get older," he told me jovially. "Like an old car, sometimes your body parts need replacing. One day science will advance so much we might be able to grow body parts back, like lizards grow their tails. I'm sure science will get there at some point, but until then we have to make do with rather dreary routine procedures." "I doubt that will happen in my lifetime," I told him, "but here's hoping." With a measure of difficulty and fumbling fingers, I put on my walking boots and ambled into the woods with Ruby by my side, who was all too eager to lift her little leg over everything and mark her territory. It was such a beguiling day. Wilder was productively working in his office, and I greedily had the whole morning all to myself. The sky was a mesmerizing cup of blue. The morning sun shimmered over the landscape. You had to be out of doors on a day like this. It would almost be a criminal offence to be indoors when the whole countryside was buzzing with the colourful, transfixing vibrancy of spring. The woodgrove was only a few hundred feet away from the farmhouse, and it stretched back for many miles. The dark earthen floor was richly fertile, due to the mulch from the fallen leaves. I felt as if the trees were hugging me as I walked through the woodgrove. It felt congenial, incredibly uplifting. The pretty bird song filtered in the air, an enchanting mix of sounds from trills to warbles, tweets and whistles. In the distance I could hear the roaring sound of the water, as I knew there was a stream around here somewhere. At one point of my walk, Ruby suddenly gave chase to a rabbit that rocketed away with the speed of the wind and disappeared into the undergrowth. Let's just say, as fast as Ruby may have been, she was no match for this rabbit, and I smiled when, exhausted, panting and breathing furiously fast, with her tongue hanging out, she came running back, with a defeated look on her face. "Don't you worry, Ruby," I assured her. "There'll be many more of those rabbits to chase. But I promise you one thing, you shan't be catching any of them." If Ruby was unimpressed with my words, she said nothing, but proceeded eagerly on her way ahead of me, and then her nose seemed to sniff something rather unfamiliar in the air, and she quickly ran back to my side, as if she drew comfort from my reassuring presence. I sensed she was a little timorous and uncertain about a strange smell that she was unfamiliar with. It made her apprehensively reluctant to move forward. In truth, if that point I had turned around to walk back to the farmhouse, Ruby would not have been remotely disappointed, which was unusual behaviour for a spirited dog who had an unquenchable energy and an unbridled inquisitive curiosity. "It's all right, Ruby. I'm sure you're worried about absolutely nothing," I told her jokingly. But I noticed her idiosyncratic, uncharacteristic behaviour was much more subdued, as if she had reservations about this unidentified smell that she'd picked up on the wind. All I could smell was damp moss, wet wood, pretty floral notes, and woody scents. In a trice the forest seemed to change dramatically, almost as if the flowers, the trees, the birds were paying close attention to an enigmatic but sharp shift in the atmosphere. Everything became quiet, and even the distant sound of water galloping over the rocks became muted. That was when I heard a very distinctive whistle, and the sound of ponderous heavy feet pounding the ground, twigs breaking, snapping and popping, leaves rustling. I could also hear another rather peculiar sound. It was the sound of a baby's chuckle. I stopped in my tracks and stood very still. I was not afraid, only extremely curious and nonplussed. The whistling got closer and closer, the chuckling more distinctive and pronounced, and for a brief second I witnessed a dark shadow through the curtain of shrubbery that was pulled aside by a pair of sizable hands with sausage-sized fingers, and that was when I saw her. I was so astounded by what I was seeing that I shut my eyes and opened them again to make absolutely sure I was seeing right. When you see something that does not conform to your perception of the natural world, it's difficult to adjust to something that is so peculiar, out of the realms of all probability. I kept thinking to myself, is this a dream? Am I dreaming? But I knew I was very much wide awake. This was no dream. At first she did not see me. She seemed oblivious to my presence, for I remained very still, and Ruby, who normally ran and barked at everything that moved, remained stoically quiet by my side. She didn't dare growl, bark, or release any sound. She just sat down by my side and stared curiously at the strange being in the line of our focus. By all accounts, she was as intrigued as I was, and was uncertain how she should react to this mysterious stranger that left me completely transfixed and caught up in a bubble of wondrous awe and bewilderment. What I was seeing was a tall, lofty female wild woman, covered in hair, standing upright on 2 feet, that if I hadn't known better, I would have described her as being what I envisaged early man to look like, although she was far superior in that regard. I perceived there was an incredible wealth of knowledge that dappled her face. I knew she was extraordinarily intelligent. I remember once when I was a girl at school, and a new pupil had started in our class. The new pupil came up to me with her math homework and asked me to help her with some equations. I looked at her puzzled. "Why are you asking me for help?" I asked her. "Well, you look like the cleverest girl in the class," she told me. I had never understood what she meant by that until now. One look at this remarkable creature's face, and I observed what I can only describe as a superior intelligence beyond my own and beyond the average man. It was written all over her in an invisible ink that I could discern instinctively. She was carrying a baby on her powerful shoulders. The little baby was covered in dark hair, matching her own. It had a pair of animated eyes that seemed to view the world as if everything was desperately exciting. The child continued to chuckle happily, with one finger still in its mouth, its dark eyes fixed on me, with an inquisitive curiosity, as if to say, "Who's that?" I observed that the hairy lady possessed long flowing dark hair. Like the night, that's how dark it was. It gleamed with a vibrant health. She was possibly 8 foot tall, and 700 pounds, with overlong arms. She possessed a streamlined, slender body, built for power and strength, but despite her gargantuan, robust size, she walked with a poise and an elegant, nimble grace, which was unusual for one so large. I have never seen a hefty ballet dancer before, but let me tell you this. This wild woman had grace seeping out of every single cell of her body like sweat. Put it this way, if she were to attend a ballet class, the pupils would probably be learning from her, not the other way round. She was born with this inbuilt grace. It was ingrained in her biological makeup. When she walked, she looked like she floated on air, and I mean that literally. I've never seen a ballet dancer being able to do that. She continued to whistle a pretty tune. She suddenly turned around to look at me directly. I could tell she was confounded to see me. I also sensed she was bashfully shy, as if she was totally unprepared for such a serendipitous encounter with me, and didn't know quite how to react to my presence. I remember thinking she had a beautiful face, with the kindest dark brown eyes I had ever seen. I do not know how long we stood there staring at each other, where no words were spoken between the two of us, beyond the little one chuckling away happily on her shoulders. But in that moment, when our eyes locked, I felt as if something special had occurred between us, as if we connected on a soul level, and there was a spark of recognition between us, almost as if in some other lifetime we had known each other before. There was a bizarre familiarity I saw in her, which is impossible to explain, so I won't even bother trying. All of a sudden, the hairy lady broke contact with me, hurriedly turning around and walking away. I tried to run after her. "Excuse me! Excuse me!" I called out, but she was gone. I looked for her everywhere, but she had disappeared into the undergrowth. I got the distinct impression she was so shy, so timorous, but I so wanted to see her again, to bask in her warm presence. There was something so uniquely special, so wonderfully outlandish about her. Ruby eagerly came out of her transfixed state. She began to run into the woodgrove, chasing after the mysterious lady, but returned back to me, with her tail between her legs, looking ever so slightly dejected and discouraged. I wished the hairy lady had not run away. Neither of us could find her. When I realized she really was gone, the forest magically came back to life, with the trills of the bird song. I hurried back to the house, eager to tell Wilder what I'd seen. I really didn't think he would believe my account for a single moment. If I was having trouble digesting something I had seen, how much more difficult would it be for someone who has not seen what I witnessed to believe my outlandish account? I knew in his shoes I wouldn't, but then one thing I noted about my husband was he had an open mind, which is a rare quality in a person, for the vast majority of people do not believe in what they cannot see, because it requires faith to do that. So there we are. That's part 1 of my story. Part 2 is tomorrow night. And there's another fabulous Bigfoot encounter, so don't forget to join in. Until next time, goodbye and good night.